We have a panel discussion this morning about the growing impact of electric vehicles on the grid. If the population in this room is any indication, it's a big deal. I'm Ann McCollister, Director of the Nebraska Community Energy Alliance, an interlocal cooperative agency of about 38 governments in Nebraska that came together in common cause to begin building EV charging infrastructure across Nebraska in 2014. NCEA's mission is to build and promote advanced technologies in transportation and buildings. We picked electric transport and large-scale utility solar as the two advanced technologies with the biggest advantages and the biggest bang for the buck in both of those sectors. With funding from the Nebraska Environmental Trust, NCEA has developed over $9 million in projects with local match and trust funding in both EVSE, residential and commercial charging stations, and solar projects throughout Nebraska. Additionally, NCEA fully funded OPPD's first EVSE rebate program to populate its EV utility study pilot last year. NPPD and the City of Fremont Utility Department joined with utility pilots and rebate programs this year, and OPPD is nearing the end of its funding for its second rebate program. Data collected since 2013 from the EV and ChargePoint projects tell us we've reduced CO2 emissions by 387,937 pounds. This is the data from our commercial stations. We have reduced CO2 from the residential stations by 715,129 pounds. The economic savings or cost to own for EV owners from the data from those stations is 81,292 and 191,337 respectively. What's provocative about this finding is that basically from OPPD's residential study is that we had double the savings and emissions reductions in 1 year of residential use compared to 6 years of commercial use. So the impact of EVs on the electrical grid has profound implications on our environment and your pocketbook. Now we're going to delve into this. We have Scott Benson from LES, Kirk Estee from OPPD, Thad Kurowski from Tesla, and Joe Francis from NDEE. And we'll get started with Scott Benson.
Thank you, Ann. Good morning. You know, at LES right now today, over 70% of our passenger fleet is either a hybrid, a plug-in hybrid, or an all-electric vehicle. And that started about 40 years ago with this beauty right behind me. That is an all-electric Plymouth Horizon that LES was driving around our service territory in 1980. Think about that. That's amazing. 40 years ago, LES was driving an all-electric vehicle. You know what's even more amazing? That it's taken almost 4 decades for those electric vehicles to finally be on the cusp of being more than a niche product in the automotive industry. So as we prepare for that, LES has been doing a lot of different research initiatives. And one of them, we're working with the Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI, and they're doing a survey-based study where they're talking to customers in our service territory to try and figure out what moves you to get an electric vehicle, and likewise, what holds you from getting one? What keeps you from going out and making that plunge? And then they took that data from the surveys and they developed a model to try to predict what our market presence might be in the future. And what they came back with that model was in the year 2030, they expect 15% of all new vehicle sales in the Lincoln area to be some kind of electric vehicle. Now beyond that, they also looked at what can you do locally to try to either speed that up or slow it down depending on your whims. And what we found out is, practically speaking, not much. I'm going to give you an example of 3 things that didn't move the needle more than 3%. They didn't increase adoption more than 3%. One was free home chargers. Their survey said if you gave out free home chargers, level 2 chargers, you wouldn't get more than a 3% uptick. The other was if you gave a $3,000 rebate on the actual purchase of the vehicle, not more than a 3% uptick. And this last one blew my mind. If the electric utility gave out free electricity for all the charging for the life of that vehicle, not more than a 3% uptick. That one scared me a little bit, I will tell you. We don't usually give out free electricity. That's a rough market. So when you look at that, you know what? Two things. There's not a lot you're going to do to change it, but it looks like the wave is finally coming. So the other thing we have to do at LES is make sure we're prepared to handle it. So we've been working on another initiative with a contract with a company called Fleet Karma. I don't know if you can see this. If you can't see it, it's not your eyesight. It's really little. That's the idea. It plugs into the diagnostic port on vehicles. We've partnered with about 90 of our customers here. They're plugged into their personal vehicles. And they allow us to collect all kinds of data. Now, it's anonymous. We don't know which car goes with which customer, but we get all the data. We know when they charge that vehicle. We know how much energy they consume when they charge it. And because it's GPS enabled, we actually know where they charge it. We also know when they drive that vehicle, how many miles they travel, all the energy they consume. Now, we started that in about January of 19. It's going to go all the way through this year and all the way of next year, 2 years worth of data. And I brought a little snippet of it with me today. So that first chart, that's the charging information. So that's the average number of people charging at any time in the day from January through September. So this is pretty much up to date. And if you can't make it out, we got midnight on the left, midnight on the right, and noon's right in the middle. And what do we draw from that? You know, not everybody, but a lot of people, when they come home from work every day or they get done running their errands, they do what? They plug their car in. And so the active charging just goes up throughout the afternoon right into the evening. Now that's important to us, and the part we really look at is LES's peak, because that's where our system already has the most burdensome on it. So we don't want to have too many people charging at that period if we can avoid it. So we go in and we say, well, let's look at when we set our peak. In July. Same profile in July, as you can see. And let's zoom in on when that peak is actually set, between 4 and 7 p.m. That's the little red box. Now you can see between 4 and 7 p.m. in July, that's not when most of the people are charging. That's not the maximum, but you know what? We're a lot closer to the max than we are the minimum. So what do we learn from that? Well, unless you do something to influence that behavior, a lot of people are going to be charging at the time of our peak, which is putting stress on the system. And I said we also have information on where those people are charging. If you look at this pie chart, 95% of all the charging is happening where? In the LES service territory. That makes sense. These are LES customers. But if we dive into that, what you see is that 92% of the charging is occurring at home. So when everybody talks about, hey, we're going to put in charging stations, you know, that's a great thing to do. But you're not putting in charging stations for the people that actually live in your community. You're putting in the charging stations for the people that travel to your community. Because what we're finding with our data is the people who live here, they charge at home. And some people are shocked by that, and I say all the time, how many of you, if you had a gas pump in your garage, would you get gas anywhere else? You wouldn't, right? You'd get it in your garage. Same thing here. When you can charge at home, that's pretty convenient. And the last thing is that trip data. So again, this is an average, January through September, and you got two charts there. On your left-hand side, that's the average miles traveled per day. And on the right-hand side, that's the average minutes people spend driving per day. And we broke it down in two different buckets, plug-in hybrids and all-electric vehicles, but you can see they're not much different. So what can you see there? On average, typical commuter day, we don't have anybody going more than 25 miles, and we don't have anybody driving their car even an hour. So if you get an all-electric vehicle and you have range anxiety, you know what? In a place like Lincoln, that doesn't exist for your average typical commuter day. Now, if you're going to take a trip and go see grandma for Christmas, that's a little different. But when you're driving around town, that all-electric vehicle's got you covered. And when you look at the plug-in hybrids, most of those people, depending on your vehicle, but most of them, they're doing most of their travel around town on their average day on the electric side. So when I show that information to different customer groups, inevitably I always get questions from folks, and one of them is, why are you guys spending so much time looking at this? I mean, there's not that many cars out there, and they're right. In our service territory today, we think there's around 400 of them. But we're not looking at that, and we're not doing the research for today. We're doing that research for tomorrow, when someday, maybe, electric vehicles aren't just a niche product, and they become, you know what, they're so common, they're just a car. And that's the day that we've got to prepare for, because it's our job to serve the community. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Good morning, everybody. Again, my name's Kirk Estee from the Omaha Public Power District. So some of the objectives today are what OPPD is working on. We want to, excuse me, on the edge of a cold, want to increase the number of EVs on the roads. understand how that's going to impact us as a utility, reduce overall carbon emissions. That is a major objective for OPPD. How to reduce the EV costs for buyers to increase the numbers, help them justify that purchase decision. We see our role also as providing education for people on EVs, and also helping people understand where the power comes from when they charge those EVs, which gets into OPPD's renewable generation profile. Whoops, blew through there. This is just a little graph showing the increasing sales of electric vehicles in America. You can see how back in 2010, real small numbers, and they're getting larger and larger. So the market is increasing for these. It is not flat, as some people have, some studies have said. And one of the things driving that is the increasing range of EVs. Look at these. I mean, we're approaching the average gas car can go about 410 miles, and we're getting all the way from the 90-mile range for some of the smaller ranges to the Teslas they're well over 300 miles. This data is not super accurate, but you can see how the ranges are just getting so high. It's almost like the electric cars are almost like gas cars in those ranges. So just a little bit of history on what OPPD has been doing to support the EV market. Back in 2018, we had 52 rebates of $4,500 and those are all gone. And then we had 90 rebates of $500 to have level 2 chargers in people's houses. And then just this year in 2019, we had $100 rebates for in-home charging to wire your house, to pay the electrician to come out and put in the plug. And then we also had $2,500 rebates to purchase an EV. And then we had $50 $500 rebates for the chargers themselves, and we do have some of those left. So we've also been going around talking with our dealerships to try to help them get up to speed on EVs, because we learned that they are not actually up to speed on those. There's a few salespeople that do a great job, but a lot of them that don't understand. So we've reached out and gone and met with them and put educational materials in the dealerships so that the customers are not left searching on the internet on their own and then just showing up at the dealership just for the final purchase. This graph is showing how, look what's happening in Britain. Now the number of public chargers actually outnumbers the number of gas stations. And so we feel that this is the trend that's coming, and from an electrical utility standpoint, there's big implications for us on the distribution and transmission side to make sure we can support this. This is just a little glimpse of where we're at today with public charging in this area. You can see there's about 30 stations. There's some level 2 stations, some level 3 stations, and some Tesla stations, Tesla only. But it's growing, and people can fill up when they need to. So what's coming from OPPD? We have a pilot that we're doing right now with 6 level 2 chargers. So we partnered with a few organizations in the Omaha area. You can see there, it's Omaha's Henry Doorly Zoo. That is a good application, we felt, for level 2 chargers, because it takes about 4 hours to charge a car. So you want to put those in locations where people are going to be for around 4 hours. So the zoo is a great application for that. Another one you can see is the University of Nebraska Medical Center, another place where unfortunately people are for 2 to 4 hours or longer. The other one is a brand new retail development that MP Dodge is working on. Then we're also working on pursuing funds from the Volkswagen Trust Fund that you heard about earlier. It's $1.2 million. So we're working on the priorities that grant talked about, which is mostly highway corridors. So we're going to be coming up with a list of highway corridor locations that are high priority that hopefully the grant will allow us to move forward with. So I look forward to any questions that come up on this panel. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm Thad Kurowski with Tesla. I manage policy initiatives across the group of Western and Midwestern states. I have a lot of slides to get through, beginning with some of the requisite pretty pictures of some of our amazing products. So let's get to it so we can get to the Q&A. This is our mission. I won't go through that. This is just a quick shot of our current product suite. This is what we use currently to fulfill that mission, from our vehicles all the way over to our software. This is I guess a closer look at our current product offering on vehicles, from the Model S through the Model Y, which will be coming out later this year. So I want to focus in on charging, and we follow as you've heard today, kind of the charge where you park philosophy, whether that's home, work, or for long distance travel. For those of you new to EV charging, this is the 3 levels of charging. It's a quick description of each, focusing on the charging for light duty vehicles. We can come back to this slide if folks have questions on that. This is the charging equipment that Tesla offers today for our customers. On the right, you'll see 2 versions of our DC fast charger, the supercharger, used to facilitate long distance travel. And then we have the sleek looking one, the second from the right, which is our urban fast charger. That's really used by customers who don't have access to charging at home, and also don't have a lot of time to sit with their car where there are longer dwell times needed, like a level 2 charger. And then the last on the left is your right, is the wall connector, or level 2 charger, which we use for a destination or workplace charging, and also for residential settings. This is a quick look at the US. Our DC fast charging network. We continue to expand that across the United States. The red dots are existing, gray dots are our planned expansion. Again, this is designed to facilitate road trips and when you need a quick charge. The numbers at the bottom of the screen here are our global deployments. Excuse me, those are not US. But let's take a quick look at Nebraska. Nebraska has 5 destinations currently. Again, we are constantly looking for new locations and looking to expand that, whether that's going east-west or north-south, depending upon where our customer, frankly, we see the need for those. Let's see. Okay, so you've heard a lot so far about the EVs and seen some of the trends. EVs are coming to Nebraska, but they're coming relatively slowly by comparison to some other states. I expect that to be increasing fairly substantially, I would say, over the next 5 years, based on, if you see some of the news, the research and development and the investment that's going in by all of the other manufacturers, as well as Tesla, as well as new competitors, frankly, in the manufacturing business. But my expectation on that expansion is, based on a lot of factors. With the low numbers that we currently see here in Nebraska, it may seem like there's going to be a long time until you see some sort of substantive dent in the total number of vehicles. But if you look at the states like Washington, California, Colorado, a number of the East Coast states, excuse me, the adoption numbers have been increasing pretty rapidly over the past 10 years. So they've had kind of this long ramp-up period with what I would qualify as more second-generation vehicles with a bit longer range. With Nebraska being a bit behind the curve compared to some other states, my sense is that once we see more compelling vehicles come next year, really, that adoption curve is going to start to get steeper here, and the time period of adoption may actually be shortened in a place like Nebraska, because as we see those vehicles come out, a new electric F-150, an electric Tesla truck, an electric Rivian truck, some of those more useful vehicles for rural applications to have that immediate torque, a place to plug in your tools when you need them, and long distance abilities to travel, those vehicles are going to be really compelling. So for utilities, I think preparation is going to be the key. There's a kind of a lot of information on this slide. I'm not going to get into some of the details of that, excuse me, and where that information comes from. If someone wants to ask me a question about it, I just find that there's so much information on the internet, but there's a lot of useful information out there. There's information that can tell you how many vehicles you have in currently, month-to-month basis, in Nebraska, or pick a state. There's also EV infrastructure you can find online. There's planning tools for how many EV charging stations would you need depending upon how many vehicles you have out there, which is what a lot of this information shows. So, excuse me, in some instances, people think about EVs and they're like, wow, this is kind of a niche market. You know, we see charging every once in a while popping up. I'm noticing it in different places. And it's somewhat of a leap of faith to think that EVs are actually going to be making a substantial dent. But what this slide shows here is that the market for EVs and EV deployment grows at a similar pace to charging infrastructure. So it's not an if you build it, you know, the charging infrastructure, they will come. It kind of all happens at the same time. You see more EVs on the road, and those who are involved, like the utilities, in providing some of that EV infrastructure, as well as workplaces and things like that, start to install what those customers are needing. So moving along here. This slide describes the typical light-duty use cases: level 2 charging at home overnight when the grid impacts are lowest and the power is typically least expensive, DC fast charging, and then the charge where you park. I want to take just a quick moment to dispel any takeaway or assumption that EVs are bad for Nebraskans because of the kind of the name of this group of presenters in this discussion, the grid impacts. Even if you take the grid impacts or potential needs for upgrades, which I'll talk a little bit more about, into consideration, and the nominal effects on those rates, the cost of ownership. So according to Kelley Blue Book, the 5-year cost of ownership for a 2018 Volkswagen e-Golf, so this is their fully electric battery e-Golf, is $9,657. So that includes fuel, insurance, financing fees, maintenance, repairs, all in. That's your operating and maintenance. 5-year ownership is about just under $10,000. The same cost for that equivalent gas car is over $18,000. So even if you take those nominal impacts on the grid and the potential for upgrades that would need to be facilitated, and the impacts potentially of those rates on customers, the savings per vehicle or per family is likely going to heavily outweigh the cost for any grid improvements. Excuse me. This slide tries to provide some perspective on the amount of energy that EVs use daily. For the sake of time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Excuse me. A little more on rate design for the utility folks in the room and on the panel. Utilities really need to consider use cases for EV charging in rate design to reflect the cost to serve that customer. And by use case, what I mean is that whether you're a business and you've got a fleet of vehicles, or you're a residential customer living in a single-family home, if you're a multifamily customer, or someone who owns an EV but can only charge at work, you really need to focus in on what your rates look like for each of those use cases in order to facilitate and essentially charge customers what they should be being charged in those instances. And it can be more complex. And it can also require something that utilities haven't done in the past, which is revisiting rates more often than they have been used to historically. This is a graph from a group called the Rocky Mountain Institute. It's called From Gas to Grid, Building Charging Infrastructure to Power Electric Vehicles. And what this shows is that the variety of benefits that electrification can provide results in a savings for all customers between $744 and $9,600 per vehicle over time. And that includes with that big discrepancy is in part due to advancements in technology like vehicle to grid, so using your battery to deploy during peak periods in those afternoon times in July where the grid needs and your neighbor needs more energy. One kind of final thing on grid impacts. For some perspective, in 2013, Southern California Edison did a study that was, at that time, they had 12,000 EV owners. So again, we got about 1,700 here in Nebraska for perspective. So they completed a report and had 6 major findings. I'm going to tell you one of those and happy to get into the rest of them. The first and most important was their approach to managing EV grid impacts was simply just to meet their customer needs, give them the power when and where they need it. And all of the 400 upgrades that they made or they identified were made to circuits that serve EV customers. So, all of the 400 upgrades that were made to serve EV customers in those circuits, only 1% of that work was required due to additional power demands from EVs. So I think that provides some perspective on what are the actual impacts on the grid. I think that we've got a lot to look at over time, and folks here will need to continue to look at that. Oh, I went the wrong way, sorry. And I think that covers the majority of the information. I look forward to the discussion, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. I want to first start out by thanking Randy Smith, who is with the department and is the architect for all things Volkswagen Mitigation Settlement Fund, and particularly the charging stations. Also thank the Nebraska Power Association and all of you out there who have commented on what the department can do to make the wisest use of the VW funds. I'm going to do 2 things today: review what we have done with those funds to date, and also talk specifically about what we're doing, what we intend to do with the charging station funds. The trust fund allocation overall, it was based on the number of offending diesel-powered vehicles, Volkswagens, that each state had. So Nebraska obviously is on the low end with an allocation of $12.25 million. In the red print, under the zero emission vehicle supply equipment option, states were able to devote 15% of the overall fund to basically charging stations. We, under our plan that we submitted to the trust, elected to pursue projects under 5 different categories. The plan allocates 10% of the state's fund or $1.2 million, to electric vehicle charging. Other projects include replacement of transit buses and school buses, and other types of diesel vehicles and diesel equipment were funded under the federally funded Clean Diesel program. It's a combination of the Diesel Emission Reduction Act program and the Volkswagen funds. We also set aside 25%, held that in reserve for projects to be determined later. We've already dipped into that in funding school buses. There's been tremendous demand and requests for school buses, so we have dipped into that fund. I should say the eligible action funds can also be used to increase the electric vehicle charging to the allowable 15% level if there is such demand for that. This chart I'm particularly proud of in that it shows the amount that we have allocated for the 5 different uses, as well as the amount of money that we have committed. Nebraska really is among the leaders in states in putting those funds to use. We have the overall trust fund allows up to 15 years to expend the funds, and we will have expended the funds within probably 5 to 6 years. With regard to who has access to the funds, it's really essentially anybody but a private citizens, businesses, state, local, tribal governments, educational institutions, and so on. With regard to EV charging equipment specifically, if you go to the NDEE website, and I hope I didn't use too many E's there because it does just start rolling. If you go to the website, we have our application form on the website. There's also a program description which Randy has come up with to explain the EV charging program. We have established a prioritization system and a few requirements for the use of those funds. One of the requirements is that the chargers be made available to the public. We're also providing prioritization for highway chargers under priority corridors, priority highway corridors. As already stated, the funds cannot be used for single-family residences, and this process is a reimbursement process. We refer to it as grants, which they are, but the applicant won't get money until the project is done. I know that applications are now being feverishly prepared. The deadline for submission of the applications is November 15th. If an applicant is able to get the application to us really probably in about the next week and a half, we will be able to take a quick look up at that application and provide anything that jumps out at us in the way of comments. Get much beyond that, and we will not be able to provide that service. We're hoping to get the awards announced just after the first of the year. This slide shows the cost share that we're going to be participating in and what the eligible costs for a charging station are. Given that DC fast chargers are much more expensive than the level 2, we did decide to provide reimbursement up to 80% for DC fast chargers, 50% for the level 2. We're looking for applications where the applicant is going to be putting skin in the game. In other words, if we get an application in that's 100% reliant on grants, that probably won't score as highly as an application where the applicant is putting in their resources in addition to any grants that they may be receiving. The eligible charging sites that we're looking at are, as mentioned, the highway corridor sites, public and destination sites, state parks, specific tourist attraction, that type of thing, and workplace sites. At the workplace site, we realize there's going to be a lot of applications there where the general public may not have access to inside the gate. In those cases, as long as the workplace provides charging stations outside the gate, that would be considered an eligible application. With regard to the highway corridor sites, we're looking at sites that are within 3 miles of a state or federal highway. The highway corridor sites, priority sites, will have to have both a DC fast charger and a level 2 fast charger. Hotel sites may have a DC fast charger. They're not required to have a fast charger. Level 2 chargers would suffice there. And And again, the sites along the highway corridors that are identified on this slide will be given priority. It's really important to emphasize that we will consider highway sites other than the priority sites that are listed here. It's really interesting with EV charging. You've got 50 states and probably 50 different ways of coming up with the EV charging programs. Michigan, for example, took information from their Department of Transportation with regard to the volume of traffic, and relied 100% on that information to establish the number of sites and the location of those sites. So it's really all over the board with regard to how states have done this. This is information from the Department of Transportation that shows where the heaviest traffic is, and so we have prioritized those sites. You'll note that the I-80 corridor is not prioritized. Electrify America has really pretty much taken care of the I-80 corridor. There are charging sites in Council Bluffs, Lincoln, Grand Island, Lexington, North Platte, and Ogallala. So in closing, we do reserve the right to partially fund an application, again, depending on the number of applications and the amount that we get. It's going to be a real interesting end of November for us, and encourage your continued participation and comments. And again, if you're preparing an application and can get it to us quick, we'd be happy to take a look at it, but that's going to have to occur very soon. So thank you, and we'll look forward to making announcements on the awards just after the first of the year.
Questions from the audience?
Excellent point. We talk about that a lot internally, and there's so many ways to do it. Yeah, you can do it with rates, you can do it with timing of, incenting timing at certain times. So those kinds of things are coming. They're not here today. A lot of that's driven by the fact that there's such a low penetration right now of EVs, and currently the chargers on most of the infrastructure take about the amount of electricity as a home clothes dryer. So we have a little bit of time, but we're definitely going that direction toward rates or incentives of some kind to get that timing to line up to save that peak.
Scott?
Yeah, I would just echo that. LES is looking at the same thing. There's a lot of different ways to do this. Smart grid's one of them, but you know what? There's probably a lot more inexpensive ways that you can kind of achieve the same end effect.
Thad, did you want to add?
Yeah, just to add something that because of the low penetrations, that's kind of an advantage that Nebraska has actually when it comes to looking at when those peaks change. Rate design is one of them. That's typically the first step that utilities go to, incent the behavior. So, you bring your car home at night, instead of plugging it in and having it charge right away, you can set your charger. You can program, sometimes it's your car, sometimes it's your charger. Tesla, you set the vehicle, you plug it in, and as soon as you get home, 5 p.m., it doesn't start charging if you time it with the off-peak hours. You can start charging at 10 p.m., charge overnight, and get low rates and via the utilities, and be incented to kind of charge when you need to, so that you don't impact the grid and so that you don't change that peak. Those studies have been done in utilities across the country and have largely, in fact, I have yet to hear of any that have not been successful in just changing people's behavior by providing them more expensive rates during peak time. But then you've got vehicle to grid as the advancement in technology happens. Then you start looking at, okay, in 10 years, is there technology that's available that you can actually pull from other vehicles that are sitting idle during those peak times so that you don't have those impacts from charging at the same time? Yeah, so for everybody who didn't hear that, the question was, there's a facility in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and a Tesla facility, and the question was, what is that being used for? And that's excellent question, something that's near and dear to my heart. So I grew up in Denver, spent my summers here with my grandparents in Fremont, actually, out at the, spent a lot of times digging around at the state lakes. So Nebraska is a close place for me. We've been, unfortunately, their dealer franchise laws in every state. And those have, took place, almost 100 years ago when a manufacturer was essentially establishing and manufacturing vehicles and trying to get them out the door as quickly as possible. So they were partnering with mom and pop dealers and, little Mercs in the middle of nowhere to sell their vehicles. And so they established these laws a long time ago. There was an imbalance of power at the time. But since then, times have changed, and a lot of those dealers are massive companies at this point, some of them with billions of dollars in revenue, or approaching that. And so we think that there's a time to start changing some of those laws. And one of the things that we've been doing is trying to change the laws here in Nebraska. Currently, we cannot have a facility, Tesla sells its vehicles directly to the customer. We do not have franchisees, excuse me, and we also service all of our own vehicles ourselves, so we're fully vertically integrated. But current law prohibits us from actually opening a service center and servicing our customers here. We've tried to change that in the past couple of years. We think it makes sense to be able to open up competition here. We think it's better for the customer as an end result. And so the reason why we opened up in Council Bluffs, Iowa, was to serve our customer base here until that's changed.
The question was, do we know who has applied or who's going to apply, and will there be enough money? I think that's the bottom line. And the simple answer is no. We do not know who's going to apply for sure. We know that, obviously there have been a number of calls, and so we have an idea of who's going to apply. In terms of the demand, I'm guardedly saying that we will receive much more in the way of requests than we have supply, but we really won't know that for sure until November 15th.
It's been said that as early as 2023, electrification could be as disruptive to the car market as cellular service was for wired telephony. How would a sudden expansion of EV charging affect Nebraska utilities from the ratepayer's perspective?
Take that one. Again, it's what we've been talking about. It's when that charging occurs. If it's off of our peak and it's on the nighttime hours, that's really complementary to the system. We build the entire system to serve the 1 hour of the year when all you folks use the most electricity, and the rest of the year it's underserved. So if we can move that charging to the right time, it's pretty beneficial and it works out pretty well for everybody.
So it's good for the utility as well.
Good for the utility, and here in Nebraska, as a public utility, that means it's good for all of our other customers. It's if you get that charging on peak and it requires a lot of upgrades, that's when it starts to put a burden on things.
Thank you. Ted?
It also depends what kind of charging it is and where it is. Like if we have a bunch of electric semis and they're all trying to charge at Sap Brothers, we probably don't have the electrical infrastructure to support the megawatts that would take to charge there. So the residential side, you could probably address with time of use and various incentives along that. But when you start having the large industrial electrification at like truck stops or like destination locations where you could see 100 electric cars charging for 45 minutes, that would lead to infrastructure changes. But hopefully you could get the rates such that the infrastructure could be compensated for.
I mean, this is the Wind and Solar Conference, so I think that what that points to is there's actually opportunity here for a lot of the folks in the room. As we see higher penetrations, and depending upon the point that you made and the use case, and if there's a fleet of large vehicles and there's a high demand or a heavy demand on the system in a particular location, that is all going to need to be sorted out, and there will be impacts from that. But when you think about it, customers will choose and fleet operators will choose to provide the infrastructure for those vehicles where it's least expensive. So that's going to be a kind of a two-way street between the utilities and those suppliers. But more importantly, I think as energy storage and wind, as we heard about earlier, can be paired with one another, bring in storage to be paired with some of the wind that's currently on the system, if not expand that. Here in Nebraska, you have an opportunity to deploy those resources when they're needed, and as we saw, wind's the cheapest thing that we've got right now, and that I don't think we're expecting to change. So there could be actually a lot of opportunity for folks here in the room.
One of my jobs is to distill down into one thought for you what EVs mean. In Nebraska, our data indicates that for the same amount of money, I can drive 4 times as far in an EV as I can in a gas-powered vehicle and pollute half as much. That's just a better car. Thank you so much.